I'm Dr. Yosefa Fogel-Rubel. This is a podcast episode brought to you by Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study. Our Vayikra series, Kedushas in the Details, explores the way the laws in the book try and elevate each of our most basic human functions: food intake, bodily functions, relationships, spaces of worship, and time. This year, I'll be taking a particularly honest and candid look at the way these laws do or do not yet function in our lives. The Cohen and Weintraub families have sponsored this podcast in memory of Sarah Bat Esther, beloved wife of Henry Cohen, a force in her field, and to all that have met her. Her greatest pride were her children and grandchildren. May we continue to make her proud. To sponsor an episode, please email me directly at podcast@matan.org.il. This is the right time to sign up for the Matan Summer Program this year, which will be dealing with war and peace in Jewish sources. You can sign up for 1 week, for 1 day, for 1 tour. I personally will be teaching there alongside other amazing Matan faculty. The program is running from July 7th to the 25th. You can check out the Matan website for more details. We'd love to see you there. I think it's going to be a very meaningful exploration of all different topics. You can see the class topics as well, which are posted online. Parshat Bechukotai contains one of the Torah's cursing and blessing passages, which highlights the correlation between mitzvah observance and the blossoming of the land of Israel and the inverse negative relationship. The final section of the Parsha is a mix of laws pertaining to temple dedications, vow dedications based on human worth, laws of cherem, and the tithes. Today I have the pleasure of welcoming back Matan's Rashat Beit Midrash and its academic director, Dr. Yael Ziegler, the author of multiple Tanakh commentaries. Yael is also a senior lecturer at Chazak College, and it is a pleasure to have her back on the podcast.
Hi, Yosefa. Good morning.
Hi, Yael. Good morning. I know I have to just say that openly to my listeners. This is my morning voice, everybody. I apologize. I get a lot of comments about my voice. So here, now you know that I'm human and that my voice is a little bit more dynamic than it seems on most of the other times that I record. So it's a pleasure to have you back here. You are closing with us the book of Vayikra. Parshat Bechukotai is not our simplest parsha. It's not our simplest parsha. It has I would say a lot of negativity, which I'm really interested to go into that with you also, because I think famously one of the many things that I admire about you is a very positive but real perspective on things. So I'm also interested to see how you look at this parsha, which is kind of threatening and ominous, to be honest. I do just want to add one thing, which I think we explored a long time ago, which is the idea that when we look at sort of parallel treaties that this is something we talked about with a bunch of our guests in the past, that in parallel treaties, like we know much of the Torah is really modeled on some of these ancient Near Eastern treaties. So and one of the core elements of them is a passage like the blessings and the curses, meaning if you follow, this is what will happen. If you don't follow, here's what will happen for you. On a theological level, I think one of the biggest thoughts, I would say ideas or difficulties that comes up in a passage like this is this the case? It brings up tzaddik v'ralo and rasha v'tovlo, because God promises something very clear, and it's not always clear in the world around us that this is exactly how things function. So now that I've thrown out some really big ideas, you actually say what you want to say.
Well, look, definitely this section is a section of reward and punishment, right? So the question of tzaddik v'ralo, of someone who is righteous and bad things happen to him, is not actually the topic of the section. It's the opposite, right? The topic of the section is we're creating a community that is supposed to look a certain way, and if the community keeps its side of the obligations, then the following are the blessings that they will receive, and if they do not look the way that they're supposed to look, then this community is going to be unraveled, right? And it will no longer be able to function in the way that it was meant to function. Now, we have 2 sections like this in Tanakh, one here in Vayikra and the other one at the end of Devarim. This, I think you're right. You said before that I have a certain tendency to look at things from the positive perspective while still remaining realistic. And for that reason, I'm interested certainly in opening with the section of the brachot. In other words, what is the positive side of this this covenant that's being created here, right? The covenant, of course, is about how to create a community that is going to receive blessing from God. But before I get there, I will just say one thing about the negative side, which is, that one of the things that really is pretty stunning, I think, in this negative side of the blessings is that God's presence there is very much felt, which I think is really part of the story of Vayikra. The story of Vayikra, as you've been exploring it for the past, several months, is the story of Kedusha, right? It's the story of how to live with sanctity, of how to live in a life in which you want to make room for God, in which you want God's presence to be there. And one of the things that we have in the second part the part of this covenant, which is negative, is that God says, if you want my presence amongst you and you are not living a life that is worthy, then my presence amongst you is going to be something which is dangerous, right? So you have that in several places. In the blessings, God keeps saying, if you walk with me in a unworthy fashion, then I will continue walking with you in a punitive fashion, right? So that to be worthy of a life in which we live with closeness to God is also to live a life of I think of paying attention, of being careful and noting that we're living on this kind of higher consciousness. So that's in terms of the negative side. I will say one thing, maybe just to open the discussion about the positive side, which is that the chapter opens with the hope, maybe even the assumption that we're looking to establish something positive. If you walk in my statutes and you do keep my commandments, look at this wonderful world that is going to unfold. Look at this wonderful society. And the society, it's defined by many things, but perhaps the final thing, or the climax here, which I think is really what Vayikra is all about, is V'hitalachti b'tochachem. I will walk amongst you, right? I will be present in your life. I will be your God, and you will be my people. And the closeness, the intimacy, is what Vayikra, I think, is striving for.
I just want to spotlight the word v'halachtem imi bekeri, right? If you translated that as if you walk with me in some sort of negative way, the word itself is very, very interesting, because on one hand, it brings up two associations. It brings up the association of mikre, meaning if you walk with me in a way that sort of doesn't pay attention, thinking of the Vayiker mikre from Megillat Ruth. And so it doesn't even sound like maliciousness. It sounds more of like a just not having a God consciousness, of not being aware of God in your life. And so I would even say, like, the sin, quote unquote, obviously there are other sins that are spoken about, but the base sin is, as you said, it's not making space for God. It's not being aware of God in your life. It's seeing missiles in the air, seeing them shot down, and saying, that's interesting. Do you know what I'm saying? Meaning that, to me, is what this means. I don't know. I'm curious what you think about it. Like, to look at that and say there wasn't more here than just an amazing symphony of human effort. And after, the Torah speaks in very broad categories, but v'halachtem imi bekeri isn't being malicious. And so it's like something very basic about how we function in the world, how we view God in our life.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what you're saying about Keri being mikra. I mean, that's what Chazal say. That's what Rashi says, that this word here means something that is kind of happenstance, right? So it's the absence of paying attention to the relationship, to what's going on around you. When you do live with Kedusha, when you are trying to create a community of Kedusha, the enemy of Kedusha is not paying attention, right? It's not something which is necessarily actually the opponent of Keri is not paying attention, right? So that when one does love with when one does live with kedusha, kedusha requires vigilance. It requires a higher state of living, a higher state of consciousness, and that's what I think. It's to pick up on your point. I think that's what Carrie means here. Maybe we'll talk a little bit about what this world of the brachot brings to mind. What is it that we're trying to create here? What's interesting here is that there are several different pieces to this world of this ideal world that is being drawn here in the beginning of this covenant. First, we have, of course, the agricultural success, right? God says, if you do continue, if you do, keep my commandments, then I'm going to give you rain in its proper time. The land will give its produce. The eitz hasadeh yitain piryo, which is an interesting description. The tree of the field will give its fruit, right? You will have so much produce that when you're reaping, you'll still be reaping when you're planting. In other words, the agricultural seasons will meet each other because there will be so much produce. That's the first piece. The second piece is that there will be peace in the land, right? You will not be afraid. The animals, the evil animals, the wild animals will no longer be in the land, right? Whether this is a metaphor for human enemies or whether it really is talking about animals is a matter of debate. But certainly within the pasuk, it seems that the pasuk is mostly about human enemies, right? And the next piece is that there will be in pasuk tet, v'hifreiti etchem, v'hirbeiti etchem. There'll be a lot of human fertility, and finally is the relationship with God, right? That God will walk amongst us, and that there will be there will be a sense of God's closeness and intimacy. Now, several of the Parshanim, including Rashi and Ramban, have pointed out that this is the kind of recreation of Gan Eden. Right? Especially, I think, what I really noted when I was looking at this section was ve'etz hasadeh yitain piryo, right? That one tree in the field, which really reminds us of some of the descriptions of Gan Eden, not just with the Eitz HaChaim and the Eitz HaDat Tov Hara, not just with the specific trees that are noted there, the tree of life, the tree of knowledge of good and evil, but also when God brings him into a garden which is already planted, kol eitz nechmad lemar'eh v'tov lema'achal, right? Every tree that is beautiful and that is, is delicious to eat. So that was sort of, my clue. But Rashi, well, I'll start with Ramban. Ramban really picks up on v'hishpati chaya ra'a mina aretz. That's where Ramban talks about it. He says the fact that there will be no more evil animals, right, points to a certain kind of harmony that is going to exist between humans and animals, which takes us back to the original state of affairs in the world, as is described in chapter 2 in Sefer Bereshit. And Rashi picks up on the
also the phrase v'hitalachti b'tochachem.
That's Rashi, yeah. Rashi picks up on v'hitalachti b'tochachem. Right. So Rashi says, well, even the form of the word v'hitalachti, right? There's that, kol Hashem mitalech began l'ruach hayom, right? Mm-hmm. That description of God's voice, kind of walking around Gan Eden, right? And the different pieces here fit together to suggest that Eretz Yisrael becomes kind of the recreation of Gan Eden, the return to paradise, right? Paradise regained, or Gan Eden 2.0, as it were. And that all these different, states of harmony that were affected by human sin, by Adam and Chava not listening to God in the garden, which leads to their expulsion from the garden, but it also leads to the collapse of land fertility and all sorts of problems in human fertility, and the cherev, that sword, which in this section we're told the sword will no longer be in the land. Well, that it reminds us of that fiery sword that's placed outside the garden after the sin that prevents them from re-entering. So here in this section, we seem to have one of the goals of Tanakh, which I think is to bring us back to that original state of affairs, no longer necessarily in something called Gan Eden, but rather in Eretz Yisrael, so that Eretz Yisrael becomes sort of the recreation of Gan Eden.
It's always this very curious question. Why does no one ever want to go back to Gan Eden? Meaning, with that whole opening of the Torah, right? It's kind of like no one's ever looking to go back to that idyllic state. And this idea becomes essentially that, well, no, because, no one needs to go back to being in that sort of like infancy stage. But we do want to go to Eretz Yisrael, which is a much deeper representation of the beauty that was Gan Eden. But this idea, well, why does no one ever seem to care that they can't get back there? And the Torah essentially says, you don't need to go there, meaning we can actually put that I would even say symbol into real life in the land of Eretz Yisrael. And so that's where we're essentially heading towards. And it's interesting, though, Yael, how subtle it is, though, meaning it's never said outright, really. It's you barely even have the word Gan. Again, we can go through those places, even though I don't know if that's our goal for right now. But it's interesting how subtle it is. It's never said one of the goals of creating Eretz Yisrael and cultivating it is to make it like Gan Eden. It becomes like a shade or like a nuance of the land of Israel.
Yeah, well, look, I think that the Nevi'im are a little more explicit about it, right? We have all sorts of psukim, ki nicham Hashem et Zion, nicham kol chovotav, v'yasa midbara ke'eden, right? Ve'arvata ki gan Hashem, right? So that the rebuilding of Israel is very much described as this kind of, flowering or flourishing that brings us back to a Gan Eden-like state. The Nevi'im are a little more explicit about it. I would say also, I know that you teach Shir HaShirim. I think also we have that section in chapter 4 in Shir HaShirim where we have this Gan Na'ul, this locked garden, and the idea of Shir HaShirim, which is this idea of this love between the Dod and the Raya, between this man and this woman, which many commentators read as the developing love between God and Am Yisrael, God and the people of Israel. The goal is to get back into this locked garden. And of course, in Shir HaShirim, when they do enter the garden, finally, what they find there is a land flowing with milk and honey, right? We have chalav and we have davash, right? So it very strongly hints to this idea. Look, again, the question as to why we're not going back specifically to Gan Eden. So you talked about, we don't want that infancy. That period of infancy was a very sort of almost helpless period, right? One in which human beings don't really have autonomy or free will or choice to some degree, right? So that's one approach. But I do think it's important to point out that there is a really big difference between Gan Eden and the land of Israel, which is, of course, the rivers, right? So that, Gan Eden is a place of rivers. The rivers remind us, of course, of the rivers of Egypt, right? Which, is something that we also have in Tanakh, that Egypt is kind of compared to the Gan Hashem at the beginning of Bereshit, like Kegan Hashem Ke'eretz Mitzrayim. And in what way are they similar? They're similar in that fertility is very, very easily obtainable there because of the river, as opposed to both Egypt and Gan Eden. Eretz Yisrael is described as a land which is, Eretz Harim Uvekaot Limtar Hashamayim Tishte Mayim, right? It's a land of mountains and valleys, and you get water there by the heavens, right? By turning to God. And that's a really, I think, critical factor that distinguishes the land of Israel from the garden. It's almost as though we're being given a better chance to be in a society which is meant to flourish and prosper and be successful, but not forget that the society is dependent on our relationship with God. And actually, what I think is wonderful is that at the opening of this section of Bechukotai, which tells us what is the ideal society, it opens with rain, right? It opens by telling us that this ideal society is about looking heavenward for our success. I will give rain in its proper time. That's part of the blessings, and that draws our attention upward. I mean, rain physically connects the heavens and the earth, and more importantly, it draws our eyes heavenward so that we recall that our prosperity and our fertility comes from God.
I think that it's interesting. I'm in a process of my life where I'm very slowly trying to go back into like a planting kind of stage. I'm in the process of like planting a garden that I want to cultivate and all those different things. And we order food from like local farmers and eggs from local organic farmers. And like in very tiny, minuscule ways in my modern life, I'm sort of like coming back into orbit with these ideas of the seasons, because we've lost sense of this connection because our food functions a little bit differently. I remember even just moving to Israel, I went back into a world where like fruits and vegetables had, well, not vegetables less, but fruits had seasons. But growing up in the States, like you really just had fruit all the time from all different places. And here it's still, you still preserve that. Like there's only going to be strawberries, you know, in a certain months, there's only going to be cherries in certain months. And the lack of connection to the land itself, again, on a food level, makes us forget the centrality of this part of our relationship. And I think that there's a little bit of a repair that we are doing as a society. We're sort of, again, there's different aims, different pockets of culture, but we are going to a certain degree, we are reconnecting, I think, to that element. And, you know, there's a stone fruit that came out now. Last week, you were able to start getting nectarines, and like, it's really meaningful, meaning, and we make a statement about that in our home, and we say shechianu and eating that new seasonal fruit. And again, in a modern world where we sort of can get whatever we want all the time, again, with certain limitations, we can forget that. But I just think that's worth mentioning again, that the Torah is working with our most basic essential system, which is a system of growing food.
Yeah, well, it's definitely spoken by someone who teaches Shir HaShirim, because that's definitely one of the messages of Shir HaShirim. Not just that it's important to be in touch with where we get our food from, but that the whole process of the seasons and the agricultural seasons is meant to cultivate certain aspects, not just of our own personalities, but also of our relationship with God. Patience, hard work, knowing that even when the winter is there and everything is underground, that the spring will come and the fruits, hanitzanim nir'u ba'aretz, you're going to see the buds begin to grow. And this is something that I think maybe modern life has prevented us from really having that experience, the fast pace of modern life. And it's created, I think, a very impatient society, right? Everyone talks about the need for instant gratification. It's not just, I think, from, social media, which everyone blames for a lot of different things, for a whole host of societal ills. But certainly this ability to connect with the growth of the earth is something which is very much part of Tanakh life, and which, to a large degree, modern Western society has lost touch with.
I just want to latch on to that pasuk you're bringing. Some of my favorite midrashim of all time are the midrashim on that parak, which speaks about, what is the spring? The spring is when Pesach happened, meaning God took the people out of Mitzrayim, not just when it was the right time, but it was because it was the right season, says the Midrash. Meaning the spring, when things are really coming into bloom, that's when Am Yisrael could come into bloom as a nation. And as just on a personal, growth, avodat Hashem level, right? And I think maybe you heard this also throughout your life, life comes in seasons. I think this is now true for men as women. It's definitely true for women. I mean, I literally am still living in those seasons, and it's something that's made me, okay, now I'm kind of crying, but it's something that's made me much more patient through these long, at this point I will say, wonderful, meaningful years of child rearing, raising, which I'm still deep in. And this reminder that we have seasons of life, and there are seasons that are more suitable for different kinds of things. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu says the spring is a season of growth. And as you said, the winter, actually, all that's cultivated, it's underground, you can't see it. And then you have times where things really come into full bloom. And that metaphor is, you could take that anywhere. Anybody listening could take it wherever it's meaningful for them in their life. But it's such an important one. And I'll just say one thing, which is that 2 weeks ago, we came to an idea, not 2 weeks ago, I recorded it 2 weeks ago, but in Parshat, in Parshat Emor, we spoke about the Omer as, ultimately you're going to harvest something at the end. You're going to come out with bread. And we spoke about that as being a very much a process of fertility, right? That there's a reaping, and then you can create something from that. And again, it's very process oriented. Someone recently asked me about like learning Hebrew and sounding Israeli. And I said, give it 10 years. And then, like, meaning these are things that take a long, long time. And anyways, I just think that that idea is so important. And yes, our modern life and pace has sort of made us lose touch with it. But here and there, I think the metaphor and the truth of the metaphor kind of creeps up on us like throughout a lifetime.
Well, I think it's worth pointing out that every year the seasons teach us to experience some measure of Tchiyat HaMetim, right? Because the earth dies and then it comes to life again. And it teaches us faith, right? Because this notion that if you walk around in the winter and you look at the fields and you look at the trees, you say, wow, there's no hope. Everything seems so dead and so, has lost its leaves and has lost its fruits and has lost its flowering. And suddenly the spring comes and you realize that the winter was a time in which fruits and flowers were waiting in this kind of dormant state under the earth, waiting to come out and flower. And to that extent, I think that really, it also becomes a metaphor for Am Yisrael. We've gone through, like we are right now, but we've gone through very difficult times in Am Yisrael's history, and the ability to hold on to hope is also about believing in Tchiyat HaMetim, which I think is something that the seasons help us to hold on to. One thing that I think is really interesting in this section of reviving Gan Eden is that there is no, we return to this very harmonious state in Gan Eden, but there's no really Ben Adam L'Chavero here, right? There's no attempt, which we had back in Parshat Kedoshim. We learned that part of creating a holy society is creating a society in which we see each other. V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, you love your neighbor as yourself. A society in which we're doing good to each other. But actually, that's not part of the brachot here, which is really interesting. I think that maybe we keep going back to Shir HaShirim. I think that maybe this absence is kind of filled in by Shir HaShirim, where the whole story is about how we create a really wonderful relationship, a very realistic and very, relationship that is filled with realism, with ups and downs, but still a rooted relationship between humans, and perhaps the most intimate relationship that one could create between a man and a woman. And that leads to us to Gan Eden, right? So there's almost these kind of two parallel courses that could take us to Gan Eden. One is to start with God, right? And the other is to start within our human relationships and find God through that, right? This relationship, we find God through serving God, right? But it's almost as though, it's two parallel courses.
I think that it's a good thing that the Torah doesn't only end, meaning we don't only have this passage. I think that they need to be read in parallel, because in so many places it is not possible to make a repaired society without taking into account all of the other, social needs and ills that exist. I think that this section is highlighting one aspect. I don't think it can be looked at alone. Not only with Shir HaShirim, which is obviously such a later work, but I think that just with so many other passages in the Torah, like this clearly can't be the only path to that. I think, though, that it reminds us, like all the Nevi'im warn, that if you think that one of them can stand alone, right, God won't want your sacrifice if it doesn't come along with. I think that seems to be clear, right, to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, like most things are clear to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but I think that that's why we have so many places where we make sure to put them together, because it could be misleading to a certain degree, I think, a passage like this. And I think that all is trying to say is that this is, as you said, one path. I think it has to be done in tandem with the other. Also because this is talking about creating a society, like this. A society isn't created by one person in the relationship with God. So at the root of this passage is the fact that it's a society rooted in that. I think to a certain degree, it's even that if at the root of your humanity is Yirat Hashem, it should bring you to be able to care for the widow and the poor, et cetera, et cetera. I think that there is a statement here about what should be at the root, which again, many may, disagree with if they want to look at it from but I think at the root needs to be this relationship with God, which is supposed to then create also a humanity. I just want to say one thing, which is that in an episode a few weeks ago with Nechama Goldman Barish, she actually suggested what you did, meaning she said that we were looking at Kedoshim, and she said, let's look at our human relationships to see how we're going to get from that to having a relationship with God. But I think that at this passage, it's suggesting, in theory, to create a society that cares for all of its weaker members, it has to start with this kind of relationship with God.
Well, I want to a little bit clarify, I think, what I was trying to say before, which I didn't say as clearly as I had wanted, which is that here God says, if you listen to me, I will give you the following blessings. What does he give them? He gives them produce of the land and peace in their country and good fertility, which of course requires also a relationship between a man and a woman, and my presence. But the one thing that he doesn't give them as a gift is good human relationships. That has to be done through us, right? We're in charge of our human relationships. God doesn't gift us with good human relationships, not between a man and a woman, and not between members of a society. But we do learn from Parshat Kedoshim, which you spoke about very beautifully with Nechama. I kept meaning to write to you to tell you and Nechama how much I enjoyed that episode. It was a wonderful episode. But again, when you talk about Parshat Kedoshim, it should be a wonderful episode, because what is really Parshat Kedoshim about? It's about how we understand that our human relationships create kedusha. They create a vehicle for God's presence. But at the same time, God doesn't give us that as a gift. That's not something that God can gift us with.
I love that. I think I love that. That's a really, really important idea. And again, in the end, it's a society that we have to create for ourselves. But again, I think at the root of that society, I think many things can create a good society. Research has always shown that, of course, it can be destructive, but religious connection is going to end up being the strongest binder between the community. So I think that that's just a fact, meaning at this point, I don't even have to say the Torah says it, but I think that it's just a fact that a Yirat Hashem in all different forms, it can come in all different forms and all different religious expressions, but that belief simply is the most successful marker of how a society can then create one that cares for all of its members.
To create a society that has higher meaning and is collectively looking for this higher meaning together. Maybe we can close, Yosefa, just by noting the importance of Shemitah in the negative part of this chapter, which is interesting, because it really the chapter chapter 26 in the covenant turns everything around and says, and if you don't listen to God, all these terrible things are going to happen, and that's because you've created a society where God dwells amongst you, and if you don't have proper vigilance, then this God dwelling amongst you can become something which is precarious situation, and God's presence among you requires you to live your life in a higher state. But it's interesting that in this section, God says, and I'm going to have to, I'm going to send you out of the land, because the land needs to experience its Shemitah. So also then, if you look again in Pasuk Mem Gimel, right, verse 43, right, the idea is Va'aretz te'azev mehem, right? The land will be, they'll have to forsake the land, v'tiret et shabtotea, because the land desires it, right? It needs that year of Shemitah. And so if you don't keep Shemitah properly every 7 years, that necessarily leads to exile. So it's interesting because, of course, the book of Vayikra is a book of Kedusha, and it really, I think, is divided according to the different spheres of sanctity in which you can find God, right? So that really the first section of the book of Vayikra is talking about finding God in a spatial realm, right? What we call in Hebrew Kedushat HaMakom, how to find God in a place. And then the middle part of Sefer Vayikra is talking about finding God within your person, right? It's really the center of Vayikra, which makes it the center of the Torah. How you create room within yourself to find God. That's called Kiddushat Ha'adam, which I think is a tremendously important and beautiful idea. This notion that human beings can be a vehicle for God's presence. And the third arena in which we make room for God is in the temporal sphere, right? What we call Kiddushat Hazman, that we create we carve out certain times of the week and times of the year in which we meet God on a higher plane. And what's, I think, really remarkable about Shemitah, and the reason I think that the book of Vayikra ends with Parshat Behar, which is a parsha in which the main mitzvah is Shemitah, is that Shemitah, of course, is the drawing together of all of these spheres, right? Shemitah is about sanctity of place. It's about sanctity of time. And it's also about sanctity of person, especially Yovel, right? Which is the 50th year in which we let all slaves go free and all land returns to its proper owner. And we don't work the land. That's true on Shemitah also. And of course, all three of these sanctities come together. So the violation of Shemitah is not just the violation of any mitzvah, it's the violation of the mitzvah that really is what is the ultimate expression of experiencing God. I'll just conclude with this final thought about Shemitah, which is that, I think those of us, I think you and I certainly both feel very fortunate to live when we live for so many reasons, and extremely fortunate to be living in Israel. And one of the ways in which I always experience this miraculous opportunity that I've received, this great gift to live in Israel, is the fact that I've been fortunate to already have 5 Shemitah years in Israel, which means that I'm dating myself. Well, one of them was really my Shana Aleph year, which was a Shemitah year. So this idea that we are fortunate to experience Shemitah, it's not something which I take lightly, and it's something which, as Shemitah year approaches, I always think to myself, how can I introduce this kind of state of heightened consciousness into our contemporary experience of Shemitah? Because it's really, I think, a very unique mitzvah. It's clearly featured very prominently at the end of Sefer Vayikra. It's a very unique mitzvah, and it's one that really, I think, the fact that we are able to experience it in some way, I think it's both a great privilege, but of course with great privilege comes great responsibility, right? That's the moment that I quote Spider-Man. But but there's this sense that when we do have this great fortune, we have to assume the responsibility of living up to it, which I think is really what this Brit is about. It's about living up to the opportunity that we've been given to live with sanctity, to live alongside sanctity. And that's something that I think is also a privilege and also a responsibility.
So this wasn't planned, but I love that so many things that we've said today are like touching upon the past 3 weeks of our podcast, because I think very much last week when we spoke about Shemitah with Rabbi Benji Zimmerman, so he really was touching upon this point, how Shemitah represents, it's everything. Meaning Shemitah is wise at Bahar Sinai. It's literally, right, Chazal also say this, it's literally encompassing all of the Torah within it, not just the 3 different kinds of Kedusha, as you said, which was also, thank you, a great summary of the book of Vayikra, but it also sort of brings into it so many different ideas. I just want to highlight one idea, which I think also complements our previous little conversation about modern life and the elements of the essence of life that modern life can sometimes sort of erase or sort of blunt their profundity, which is the idea of resting. I think that in this section of Bechukotai, meaning it's both saying that the land won't keep you here if you don't keep its shmitot, because you're not keeping a mitzvah. But I think it's also saying one level, I think there's multiple levels of that. One level is that the land must rest, right? You cannot think you can keep working something without letting it rejuvenate. Now, one of the many goals of the Shemitah year is to take time off so that you can then reflect and strengthen your relationship with God. It's everything. It's literally all encompassing. But just to take that into our personal lives for one moment, which is to go back to the modern pace of life, Shemitah is one of the many, many, many elements in the Torah that reminds us that human beings also cannot keep going without taking a rest. Now, many of us don't work in jobs that have sabbaticals. We're not all teachers or we're not all academics, okay? But the Torah says, Eretz Yisrael, the most powerful, life-giving force that I can ever describe for you, cannot continue without taking breaks, without both physically taking a break and having the people who live in it be the kind of people who take off time to reflect on how their society is running and what their relationship with God looks like. And I think that even for somebody who's listening, who doesn't have a built-in Shemitah year because they're not living in Israel or because they're not in a profession that has that, it's just a necessary reality that either someone sort of intuits it or comes to that realization because they already went past their own personal red line of how much they could function, or right, it's just a fact. And I'll just say a personal example, which is that people always like ask me these questions, and I'm sure you get it even more than I do, but like on a personal level, like how does your life function? How does it actually work that you have X, Y, or Z job and you also have kids of this age? And I always say to them, it does not look in reality how it looks on the outside. Meaning I have multiple days of the week where I don't have to show up anywhere at 8:30. It's like a major part of how I can function during the week. And like this built-in system of having rest while also being busy. So that's like a miniature version of that. But I think that it's such a powerful statement that the land needs, right? It literally is, it needs that break time. It needs it because it physically needs it, and needs it because the kind of people who live in Eretz Yisrael need to be the kind of people who could take a year off and find ways to flourish better and to have a meaningful relationship with God.
Well, what you did say, which I'm sure all of our listeners are thinking, I'm sure you're thinking as well, is that that's what makes it parallel to Shabbat, right? Because every week, and that's one of the secrets of our ability to work during the week. It's Sheshet Yamim Ta'avod. Yeah. It's that we are meant to be productive for 6 days, and that production also is intertwined with our rest on Shabbat. But I want to really conclude with a final thought that relates both to Shabbat and to Shemitah, which is that the rest is not just for us to regain our strength so that we can work the other days. It's also to regain our spiritual resources. And that's true on Shabbat. And it's especially true on Shemitah, when this idea that we don't have to work the land it frees us up to think about other things. And the Rambam's Mishnah Torah is a very technical work, right? And he's mostly talking about what you would call like pure halacha, right? But every once in a while he goes off in a direction which is a little bit more ideologically oriented. And at the end of Hilchot Shemitah, he talks about how every person can choose a life to be like a Levi. If he chooses to devote his full-time resources to learning Torah, he has the opportunity to be Levi-like, right? Of course, the tribe of Levi is a tribe that doesn't own land. And so basically their lifestyle always looks like a Shemitah year, right? Like we, during a Shemitah year, we're not meant to work the land, and therefore we have the opportunity to devote ourselves to developing our spiritual resources. But the Rambam chooses to end his commentary on, or his halachic commentary on the laws of Shemitah by sort of turning his attention to some of the advantages of the Shemitah year. He doesn't say that explicitly, but he basically says explicitly that we can all choose to be Levi-like by devoting our spiritual resources, as much as possible to serving God. And I think that that's his takeaway lesson from the experience of Shemitah.
Yael, thank you so much for this conversation. I actually just wanted to end today's episode with a little bit of a conclusion, since we're concluding now the book of Vayikra. And I just want to say that I'm always so amazed at how many layers we can unfold each year. I know this is our third cycle of the book of Vayikra. Just it so brings up for me the endless nature of Torah study and the unbelievable, amounts of meaning and depth of being that really come through every time you sort of sit with somebody and talk with them in Torah. This year, I really tried to push myself and my guests to ask some harder questions. We spoke about if we even want sacrifices. Does Tzarat have any real relevancy to our lives anymore? We spoke about Shemirat Negiah and Harachakot. What really is Kedusha? We've met new guests. And that also is something that always confounds me, how there's just so many erudite, moving, thoughtful teachers and scholars and to engage with around the world. It's something that really, really, really moves me every time. And I'll just bring us to our next series coming up, which is that our Bamidbar series is actually going to have both a series theme and a guest theme. As a series theme, we'll be focusing on community building and challenges. And our guests, all of the guests I will be speaking with, are themselves communal leaders from around the world. And I've put a special emphasis on really trying to speak with people from all over. So it's sort of both, we'll have some from Israel and many from outside of Israel. And I really want to hear about and speak with them about the Parshiot, and also about how different Jewish communities around the world are dealing with their building and struggles during this complex time. So I'm really interested to see how those conversations unfold, and I'm looking forward to continue learning Torah with all of you and with all of our guests as well. So thank you so much, Yael, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you, Yosefa.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode from Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study. If you would like to sponsor an episode, please contact the Matan office or email me at podcast@matan.org.il. Please do us and all women's Torah learning a favor and share this episode with all of your friends and family.